The Liberty Report. With us today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
Happy Thursday, Dr. Paul.
Thursday.
Thursday.
Already.
Thursday's my Friday.
Moving along quickly.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we have to get a good story out today, and we keep looking and looking. We should have an interesting story.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily, well, it's not really good news. It's facing up to reality, getting history written at this particular time, because we're going to quote Stephen Kinzer. And Stephen Kinzer was on our program once, and he wrote a book, The Brothers, in detail about the two Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles. I found it fascinating. It was so fascinating book I read. I even sent you a copy.
You did, and I read it,
and we talked about a lot. Then we had Stephen on the program.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, he has an article out. He writes in the Boston Globe, and it caught our attention. Because he's writing, I think of him as a historian, but he's a philosopher and all this. But he wrote this article that caught our attention. Biden promises diplomacy but offers more militarism.
Yeah.
So what's new? That could happen with a Republican saying actually those same things. But I don't think many people wrote that headline with Trump, even with his inconsistencies and even his own admission that he didn't do quite as much as he would like to have done. But I find this book very interesting because he's pointing out the hypocrisy of it, both the hypocrisy of Biden, but Biden's almost, to me, Daniel, what I think of him under these circumstances, he's irrelevant. He's not in charge of anything.
It doesn't seem like it.
So the people who are in charge, has him doing certain things, and when he's allowed to speak, that gets stranger and stranger about how he's being handled. But he did have a program. He still spoke out on certain issues, like all of them do, and most of them don't follow through. But the interesting thing is when he did things not quite like people had hoped the progressives would get done, all of a sudden his greatest cheerleaders turned to be Republicans. If he finally goes back to bombing Syria, and being tough on Iran, and they thought that probably Biden would be too soft and that sort of thing. But no, he's gotten some support from the Hawks in the Senate, probably anybody there at all. It's interesting to see how this will play out with the progressives, on both parties, and how they will maintain some type of rapport with the president, because that sort of is the splitting of the Democrats right now. But there's good unity now, with the Democrats. Money is being spent. They barely signed a bill for $1.9 trillion. Do you know they're working on another one?
Yeah, I saw that.
Oh, boy. And, but the markets don't seem to care. I care about it. A lot of other people will be caring very much about it. But right now, we want to care about, the foreign policy, because in a way, people pick articles that sort of support their positions, and we've talked along these lines that not much is going to happen, and when you really look into it, you find that the Republicans and Democrats are very much in agreement on foreign policy of intervention, even though they can argue a lot and they can play the games. But the military-industrial complex never sweated any. And you would think that the Republicans are known for a strong national defense and spending all this money, and Trump did spend the money, but they still supported a lot of Democrats. They cover their bases. And this is why we have a policy right now that Stephen wrote about and talked about the inconsistencies of the promises and what's going on behind the scenes, what the diplomats are not doing.
Yeah, and it's I don't know if people really thought that things would change in foreign policy. In a way, they have changed, but this is what Stephen Kinzer starts out by talking. He says, diplomacy is back at the center of our foreign policy. Kinzer starts by quoting him, we must start with diplomacy. But then Kinzer goes on to write that in the 4 weeks after making that speech, he bombed Syria. He didn't start talks with Iran. He gave Saudi Arabia a pass on this finding that they murdered this journalist Khashoggi. We talked about that last year. And it looks like he's not going to get out of Afghanistan. And Kinzer rightly points out that he was given an invaluable gift in this signed deal under Trump to pull out by May from Afghanistan, and how easy it would have been for him to say, okay, we negotiate, the peace was negotiated, we're leaving. The same thing with Iran. He came in with promises of getting back into the Iran deal, and now he's lost valuable time. And he could have just gotten in and said, hey, we're getting back in the deal, full stop, first day, and it will change things. So nothing is really changing, as Kinzer points out. And you can see this, Dr. Paul, in the statements from the person who's really running his foreign policy, because as you point out, and I'm uncomfortable with a lot of this talk, but the last couple of times I've seen Biden, I've not been impressed. You know, the last 2 or 3 times he's sort of sauntered around as he's thinking he's going to take questions, and then they cut the feed and his handlers pulled him out. It's not looking good. But I wanted to show just a couple of things. I'm just going to show the first one first and then kick it back to you, because let's look at the first clip. This is Blinken kind of going along with this is Secretary of State. He's got some pretty fancy graphics people making him look very stately. But here he says, we will never hesitate to use force when American lives and vital interests are at stake. But we'll do so only when the objectives are clear and achievable, consistent with our values and laws, and with the American people's informed consent, together with diplomacy. And this was put out just about a week or so ago after Biden bombed Syria with no permission, no consent, and no real demonstration that it has anything to do with American lives or vital interests.
And Stephen goes on after he describes the ineptness and the lack of following through and the problems that interventionists have. He goes on and he makes several suggestions of, what he should do, and be somewhat related to his promises. And I want to mention those, and we can make a comment on them, because there's some pros and cons even on his suggestion. But you already mentioned the Iranians and the relations there, but he says ease the sanctions. We'd have no trouble with that, because we don't support the principle of sanctions unless there's a declared war. You might want to stop trading with somebody you have a declared war. That's why the declaration of war is so important. You might act like it's a serious matter, but when you play games with it and then continue sanctions and benefits sometimes too. We continue to send benefits even though we have sanctions on them. But his first suggestion would be ease the sanctions on Iran. So
yeah, and that's what he said. That's what Kinzer says. But here's the reality. Let's look at the next clip from Blinken, because this could be, a Trump administration. Iran is moving in the wrong direction. It continues to take steps that lift the various constraints of the agreement, and is making its program more dangerous, not less dangerous. We want to see Iran come back into compliance with its obligations. Well, it's farcical, Dr. Paul, because it's the U.S. that's out of compliance. The U.S. left the deal, and Iran's increasing the level of enrichment of uranium is consistent with the details of the deal. If parties leave the deal, if the deal breaks down, it's in the amendments to the deal that they can increase, and they've done that in a very cautious manner. They haven't said, hey, we're going to do a bomb. Very cautiously, they've slowly upped the stakes, upped the costs of the U.S. continuing to violate the JCPOA deal. And here's Blinken saying the other thing, the opposite.
It's amazing. We get out, and the others are making an effort to make it work, but it makes it a lot weaker when we're not in it. But then to have the arrogance of saying, we're taking it and you go fly a kite, but we're going to tell you what to do. Yeah. We're going to blame all the problems on Iran. But then, of course, they have the propaganda on their side, because they have the people conditioned that whether it's China or Iran and you show that you want to be neutral with them, they turn it into a positive and that you're a disloyal American. the next one that he mentions, and we've mentioned this already and that many times in the past, is the troops out of Afghanistan.
Yeah.
That's something that's coming up.
Yeah.
Now that's another one that's easy for us. You know, we just marched in, we just marched out, so that's what we should do. But it seems like it's a struggle. Now somebody thinks that the reason is the pragmatic reason has nothing to do with philosophy and truth and promises. It has to do with who's going to get blamed for the war, you know, or the loss, and you know who lost Nicaragua, who lost Afghanistan. So therefore, he doesn't want to be the guy to close the door on it. And what gets me on that, Daniel, is the fact that you know they think automatically if you get out and the war ends and we have better relationship, it's a negative for you in history. And it seems to me that it would be the opposite. And also they say it's always a sign of weakness, you know, to walk away from a stupid fight, you know, and provoke the fighting. And so they keep using this, but it looks like it's not going to change. That policy is not likely to change. My guess is that by May, we're still going to have troops in there.
Yeah, and that's why, you know, Washington's foreign policy doesn't change, because it enriches Washington so much. You know, the war machine is the lifeblood of Washington. And we had a piece up that we reprinted from Jonathan Turley. And if you want to know why we're never going to get out of Afghanistan, because it's extremely profitable to the war machine in Washington. It's welfare for the rich. And he wrote about this. You know, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction periodically releases reports. It's probably the only truthful thing coming out of government, because they look into the waste and the fraud and the abuse that goes on in this years-long, decades-long occupation of Afghanistan, a ridiculous war. But here's just one example, and it just takes one example to sort of prove the whole thing. And here's Turley. He's talking about the U.S. Air Force spent $549 million to buy 20 Italian-made cargo planes for the Afghan government. They were found to be unreliable and turned into scrap metal for $40,257. $500 million in planes. Actually, they were totally useless, but the general who helped the deal go through ended up on the board of that airplane company, but nothing happened to him. $500 million turned into $40,000 in scrap metal.
Boy, it's good that we have a money machine. We'd have trouble paying those bills. But the question is that money going to buy something next year that it buys this year?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I want to go on to the next one that he suggests. Why shouldn't we just participate and get involved in the settlement of the war in Yemen?
Yeah.
And I think with reservations, and you may follow up on this, I think that yes, we can, but to really help it's simple. It's one where we just quit helping one side or the other. You might say, you know, no, you have to do more than just help because you have to, the Saudis are killing Yemenis, so we have to go after the Saudis and this sort of stuff. But if you just work to or use a non-interventionist position, the war ends. And yes, there's going to be suffering on some side, but to assume that we have to pay for the settlement, usually when we go in and do the peace deal, it's usually just more money, and it doesn't work. But that's a good idea, but I think the way it does it, we would be cautious on exactly how we'd carry it out.
I mean, you could almost do a 2-for-1, because the way to solve the problem in Yemen is to stop backstopping the Saudis. No more weapons sales at all, but Washington would freak out over that, because that's what keeps things going. You could do a 2-for-1. No more weapons sales, Saudi Arabia, and we really strongly encourage you to stop the war in Yemen. It will be over very soon. But I'll throw out one now, since we're throwing out. This is another example where President Biden could have been better than Trump, but he wasn't. And let's look at this next one. Here's Blinken again. This is just a few days ago. Today, Venezuelan interim president Juan Guaido and I discussed our unwavering support for democracy in Venezuela and our efforts to improve the lives of the Venezuelan people. It's almost as if he's a parody of himself, because if you really want to improve the lives of the Venezuelan people, how about ending the sanctions? And the idea that interim President Juan Guaido represents democracy is so farcical. The rest of the world must just laugh at it. A, he's not even the president of the Parliamentary Assembly any longer. Guaido is not. So he has absolutely no legal claim to anything remotely near the presidency. He never even ran for the office of the presidency. So how could restoring this U.S. puppet, how can installing this U.S. puppet represent a triumph for democracy? It was completely boneheaded when when Trump and his crew went into this ridiculous Afghanistan regime change, and now Biden is, not only is he continuing it, Dr. Paul, you may have seen this, he's making it worse because he's just granted thousands and thousands of Venezuelans here illegally that they can stay here and have residency. So rather than make their country better so they may want to go back home, most people would rather go back home, he's saying, oh, no problem, come on in, we'll let you in. So he's
yeah, and I think your last point is one that I intended to emphasize, because immediately you can turn the switch. Oh, just open the doors. They can come in, and we will be helping them, and they'll all go on our programs, and they'll get citizenship in no time.
Yeah.
And where does whom does it help? It helps Democrats, and they've been doing this. But you know, if you don't help, if you pursue with sanctions and all this interference, whether it's bombs or sanctions, it's always the people that suffer. The bombs, they kill civilians. Occasionally they allow people to be assassinated, but they kill the civilians, and then the civilians tend to come up without food and shelter, and the people who run the governments, you know, they get by. But that is why it should be more precise what non-interventionism is, because once you permit the intervention, then they're all over the place. Today we'll do this, today we'll do this. We're not violating the principles. We're just getting smarter people in to know how to put on sanctions on the right bad guys. Oh no, we'll put it on this guy too. And if the country doesn't respond like we want, we just add on the sanctions. It's not a good policy. Quickly, I wanted to also mention what Stephen said. He thinks that we should continue to pursue some talks in North Korea.
Yeah.
And Trump did this at the beginning, and there was a lot of controversy, and of course the Hawks didn't like that. But you can, talk's one thing, you know, and diplomacy is one thing, but that doesn't mean that you're joining, you know, North Korea, you know, in their politics. And also he advises, which is just common sense, you know, make overtures to Russia and China. You know, I understand Nixon did that one time, and it didn't lead to worse things. You know, it led to some improvement, but they're sitting in limbo right now. But those are his suggestion. And one last one that he made that I've been talking about for a long time, because this really is something we should be concerned about, because it's so close to home. Even in the 60s, I said, what are we doing in Vietnam? Why don't we deal with Cuba? Cuba had those missiles there and all that. So yes, what he's saying now, give them diplomatic relations, just talk to them and work with them. Other countries are doing it, and that would be a move in the right direction.
It definitely would. But instead of, as you say, opening to China and Russia, instead of doing that, the Biden administration is actually going in the opposite direction. And I'll just do two more quick ones from Blinken. I look for statements from Biden, but he's not talking much these days.
He's in his basement.
Yeah. Here he is, March 2nd. Here's Secretary of State Anthony Blinken. Today, the U.S. imposed sanctions on Russia for attempting to assassinate Alexei Navalny with a Novichok nerve agent. This could be John Bolton. And in fact, if you remember, Dr. Paul, when Senator Paul was questioning the nominee for Deputy Secretary of State, he made a great comment. He said, "This foreign policy, you guys just look like liberal versions of John Bolton." And this is exactly this. They've never provided any evidence that Russia used Novichok to try to assassinate Navalny. And here's the next one, too, and it's the same thing. This is really back to the future. 3 years ago today, Russia poisoned Sergei Skripal and his daughter with chemical weapons on British soil. That story is so full of holes, it looks like Swiss cheese, yet rather than trying to move on from what was obviously a very incomplete at best story, the administration is doubling down on its aggressiveness toward Russia and China. So Kinzer's right. They've had a lot of opportunity. The problem is these people are all products of Washington. You know, the products of the foreign policy mindset of Washington, which is that we have to do it. If we don't do it, someone else will, and they'll do it to us, and it's bringing us into the poorhouse.
I want to finish up this segment by emphasizing once again the difference between being a strong president and a weak president, because sometimes a strong president does things that aren't popular and he backs away and he's not militant, and it's very, very valuable, but the consensus is against him, and that is considered very weak, and sometimes considered treasonous that you are actually talking and doing things like this, they much rather would complain that if you do that you're called a very weak person, and I think standing up for what is right sometimes is difficult, but on the long run I think there's a great benefit. So I think Stephen Kinzer's in that category of looking at the long term and giving good advice about non-interventionism, but he hasn't been invited to be in the Biden administration.
Unlikely too. Well, let's move on, and I know you've got a piece on this person, and I do. Coincidentally, we both found something on him, but we have to do this because we have to continue to demonstrate what a fool this person is. Here's Dr. Fauci. He's back again. He's praising Australia's COVID lockdowns. Fantastic. They have the most strictest lockdowns in the world, I think, one of the strictest in the world. He thinks it's the greatest thing ever. Lock them down, lock them down. But look at this next one. Here's Planet Reality. Let's look at this next clip. Here's the reality of Australia's lockdowns. Australia projects more deaths from suicides in lockdown than from the virus itself.
Oh,
and so Fauci thinks this is just fine. This is a perfect example of the twisted thinking of Tony Fauci. And I think history is going to look back and wonder, what on earth were these people thinking listening to this coup?
Yeah, I think you're touching the right thing. You can't say, where did he come from? How could he believe these things? It isn't that. It's where does he get his following? Yeah. How does he achieve this? And why do they bow down to him? Anything he says. But, he's misleading them. It's confusing. If he did it consistently, at least they would say, well, this is the philosophy he followed. But he's all over the place. And I want to mention just a real recent statement came out from Zero Hedge, and this is, you will have a hard time believing this. It says, watch, Fauci admits there is no science behind continued lockdown. We won. He's on our side till tomorrow. But this was the quote. And this is directly from Fauci. When you don't have the data and you don't have the actual evidence, you've got to make a judgment call they're talking about masks and things and whether or not you've had the immunization. They don't know anything about who's immune and who isn't, whether you have the shot, and they don't think the immunity, natural immunity, is as good as if you get this shot that nobody knows anything about. It's not been around long enough, and they do a little bit of guessing. And essentially it says that Fauci replied by declaring that Americans will just have to trust the CDC. So that's what we need, is more trust. And I'm working on it. I'm trying to think, but I think we should trust our own judgment and look for some help and try to be as consistent as possible and know what our goals are. And I think we do a pretty good job there.
Yeah, well, I'll just close by again reminding our friends out there who are watching, listening to us. I have included a link in the description to sign up for free updates from the Ron Paul Institute, which is the sponsor of this program. And as I always say, we don't rent, sell, give away, or anything your name. It's absolutely private with us. I just did another update. I just sent out another update last night. I wrote a little bit about some of the latest happenings in this sort of war on the COVID tyranny, and I'd like to share it with you. So I will resend to all of our new subscribers today. So just go to that link, click it, and sign up and get free updates from the Ron Paul Institute, because we never know when we might be forced to go silent. So we want to keep in touch with you. Dr. Paul?
Very good. The big question is, how do we get involved in this? And this is something that Daniel and I dealt with as the Middle East crisis was building after 9/11. Why do we have to do this, and how did we get into so many wars, and we're still in them, and without presidential declaration, congressional declaration, and the president's getting the authority to do this? And Then the other thing that people don't seem to consider is the people who pushes it no matter what. You've mentioned it many times, the military-industrial complex. They have an agenda that's very strong, and they get along fine, calls themselves, they don't care whether they're Republican or Democrat, they look at the bottom line. So they do that, and they think that's all there is to it. But the people who fight the wars have so little to say, but they say, oh, well, that's why we remember the old thing was an 18-year-old a lot ago, he gets drafted, sent off to war and can be killed. So therefore, the young people should be voting on this, and they give the right to vote. But it turned out that it didn't change a whole lot. I always thought it was a great idea, but I'm not so sure I support the idea that the young people should be determining everything, because now the left is proposing you only have to be 16. By the time you're 16, you're smart enough. Well, there are some 16 years old a lot smarter than some of these old timers I knew in the Congress. But I always believe strongly that these wars aren't started by young people who have fight, especially the ones that get drafted. And in a way, some get drafted because of economic pressures. The draft is not there, but the illegal effort is still there. It's still legal to have a conscription. So it's there. So people are pressured to do it. And my argument for this is the young people don't start wars. You get a few that propagandize with the establishment. But young people in the United States didn't get together with the young people of Vietnam and say, I think it's about time we had a good little fight. I think we should have this war, so we're going to antagonize you and you can invade us, and we might carry this on and we can get a lot of heroes. Absolutely zero. It's insanity to think that. But that's more or less what happens. The young people, are in the middle. They don't get together and promote it. It's the older people that are making money, the warmongers and the profiteering that happens. That's probably where the biggest effort is. People will say, Ron, you're completely wrong. This is for national security purposes. Let me tell you, from my experience and from my judgment, I do my best. It has very, very little, if nothing, to do with national security. They name it, and how can you oppose national security? That's when they say, you are a traitor and you are committing treason because you're supporting some people that did A, B, C, and we have to go and stop them. We have to take them over. And that's why we're in 150 countries. That's why we're the country that gets involved in the most coups in the world. And that's why we have this presence around the world. So I think honesty is good. I think the enemy has to be recognized. We have to know what we're dealing with. But we have to know what our own side is doing, where the major responsibility is. So everybody in this country has a responsibility. Instead, what do we hear? If you don't invite 1 million people into your country and start spoon feeding them and taking care of them, everybody, that you are the evil person, no matter who may be coming and how much undermining of our freedoms occurs. So I think that there's a lot to be learned, and unfortunately there are a lot of victims. We'd like to improve on that condition, I'll tell you. And I do want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.